Welcome to the Einstein Forum, and welcome also to our guests on Zoom. One difference between the Einstein Forum and other German institutions, there are quite a few, but one difference is we don't go in for long, flowery introductions. I remember one German event where I felt like the moderator could have doubled as one of Henry VIII's courtiers, taking bows and saying, "I hope you will forgive me that I don't name all of your publications and prizes." I am not going to do that. I will just say I'm really happy to welcome Adam Shatz, U.S. editor of the London Review of Books, and author of a number of books of his own, and Zadie Smith, the London author of many novels and essays. We're here to discuss Adam's book, which appeared about a year ago in English, The Rebel's Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon. Do you want to hold it up just to go? Well, you could get some outside, by the way.
Looks a little different.
Anyone who wants one. It's interestingly enough, since German institutions love to celebrate round-numbered birthdays, last year was a year-long 300th Kant birthday party, I thought we would have been competing with others to celebrate Fanon's 100th birthday, which this year is. But I've seen no announcements other than our own, and I wanted to start our conversation by asking Adam, did they all read your book and decide it didn't fit Fanon into the traditional categories of postcolonial theory? Because that's what drew me to the book and made me decide to review it. So if you would start there. Why is this book different from all other books on Fanon, with the possible exception of a wonderful book by Atoseki Otu, the Ghanaian philosopher?
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Zadie, for joining us. Really honored to be here, and thank you for all coming. Thank you all for coming this evening. Admittedly, it might seem odd to write another biography of Frantz Fanon, because there are other books on Fanon, and there are some very good ones. In fact, back in 2001, or I think it was 2001, I reviewed David Macy's meticulous biography of Fanon for the New York Times. And if you want a thorough soup to nuts biography of Frantz Fanon, read Macy, not Shatz. This is a different kind of a book. I had felt that none of the biographies of Fanon really captured the lived experience of being Frantz Fanon, the relationship between the life that he led, and the dangerous life that he chose once he joined the Algerian liberation struggle, the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, and his thinking. Nor did any of these books really address the dynamic relationship between his work as a psychiatrist and his politics. And Fanon was, after all, a practicing psychiatrist almost till the end of his life. This book is not an attempt to dismantle the post-colonial reading of Frantz Fanon, or to advance one particular reading of his work. I think that there can be many readings of Fanon's work, but my sense had been that to quote Marie-Jeanne Manuelon, who was Fanon's secretary, and she's the person he dictated his books to once he got to Tunis. Marie-Jeanne said to me, what I resent is that in all of these books on Fanon, he's coupé en morceaux. He's cut into pieces. So you have the post-colonial Fanon, you have the Algerian Fanon, you have the West Indian Fanon. You have the Fanon of black consciousness. You have the Fanon who is the critic of racial essentialism. And I wanted to give a portrait that captured Fanon as a whole, including in his contradictions. Fanon died at 36. He was still finding himself. He was still figuring out where he might belong. I mean, I don't think he even knew where he would end up after the Algerian Revolution. He died he died some months before Algeria achieved independence. Fanon was a searcher. I mean, I think of him in a way as the John Coltrane of anti-colonialism. Constantly reinventing himself. Coltrane goes from hard bop to sheets of sound to free jazz, and Fanon is engaged in a similar process of questioning. The last sentence of Black Skin, White Masks, his first book published in 1952, is, "Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions." And yet, oddly, we forget that Fanon was a person of questions and that he continued to ask them throughout his life. You see this, for example, in his psychiatric practice, rather. He was constantly reinventing himself as a psychiatrist. In the 1950s, he was practicing institutional therapy, essentially creating these micro-societies to reintegrate the mentally ill into something like their ordinary lives in the asylum. By the end of his life, he's become a critic of institutionalization. So that's one example. And we see this in his political thinking as well. We see this in his reflection on community, on violence. We see this in the contradictions that permeate the writing, or at least the tensions. For example, the tension between his advocacy of armed struggle and his intense awareness, expressed in the last chapter of The Wretch of the Earth, of the lasting injuries of violence, not just of colonial violence, but of anti-colonial armed struggle. So my purpose was not to resolve these contradictions and to show that Fanon had everything mastered. My purpose was to expose and explore these contradictions and to show that, in a sense, they also tell us something about our own dilemma. We see this, for example, in our relationship to matters of the concrete and the universal. There are people who are very strong believers, let's say, in identity politics, and others who are equally dogmatic in their opposition to identity politics. Fanon is someone, I think, who found a way to avoid these traps. He's someone who insists on the anguish and irreducibility of the black condition in a white world, and at the same time, he sees that the experience of racial domination or of bigotry can actually lead to forms of solidarity with other people who have suffered different forms of discrimination, because he believed profoundly in the human. I mean, Fanon was a humanist. I think he's sometimes been mistaken for an anti-humanist, as someone who sort of prefigures the themes of, let's say, radical postcolonialism or the critique of the Enlightenment. In my view, he's both a passionate critic of the failings of the Enlightenment and very much an Enlightenment figure, just as he is a critic of French republicanism and its colonial hypocrisies, and in a sense, an expression of the best aspects of French republicanism. So that's why I decided to do this book, to really provide a complex and nuanced portrait of this man. And there's a point in Black Skin, White Masks where Fanon writes that his greatest wish had been to be perceived as just another person, as a man. And yet this dream had always eluded him. And I found that to be the case with much of the writing on Fanon. He was turned constantly into this icon, this prophet. And obviously the aura of the prophet, Fanon, sacrificed his life for the Algerian struggle. That aura is is, I think, an essential aspect of his appeal. I mean, one of the reasons that people are attracted to Fanon is that he lived this extraordinary life. It's not simply the writing, it is the life, it's the arc of the life. But he wasn't a prophet, he was a man, and so I've tried to convey that story here.
He wasn't only a man, he was 36 years old when he died, and I think that comes across very clearly. I also really liked the quote where his secretary said these were pamphlets. They're not written in stone, they're pamphlets written when he was working God knows how many hours a day as a psychiatrist.
True, and also, Fanon is someone who had the audacity at 27 to take on the most influential thinker of the era, Jean-Paul Sartre. He wasn't someone who was looking for answers from powerful individuals who thought he could find the answers in old books. I mean, he insisted that what makes us human is the leap of invention. And I think that we have to apply that to Fanon as well.
But that's also why our interactions with him should not be exegetical or constitutional. Like, it's so strange that the way Fanon has been discussed is with this almost constitutionalism principle, that this is the text, this is the holy text, this is how it is to be read. I would think he would be amazed to find himself interpreted in that rigid and formal manner.
So can you talk about how you read him, Zadie? Or read him now? Has it been a process?
Well, that was what was so joyful to me about this book, because I first read him when I was, I think, 10 or 11, because my mother was studying she was trying to get an education, and part of it was studying to become a social worker, and she hoped to be a therapist. So on her shelf was a lot of Fanon, and she'd also come from another, racialized island, which I think sometimes gets lost in the American discussion of race. My mother, like Fanon, very dark-skinned, and lived on an island in which colorism was a day-to-day part of existence. And one of my first experiences with Fanon is reading Black Skin, White Mask and going to Jamaica and finding myself part of that system immediately. I was a very awkward, heavy 15-year-old, braces, glasses. My mother was a great beauty, but in Jamaican terms, I was the thing of interest. And so you suddenly find yourself inscripted into a system that is repulsive to you. And that fascinated me, that my mother had to struggle through this island, which I hoped, in English terms, you hoped to think of it as this unified, beautiful, diasporic island. But my mother's experience of it, like Stuart Hall, like Fanon, was of a very hierarchized, can I say that? Oh, that's not a good word. Repressive place for a dark-skinned person like her. So my first reading of Fanon was like that. It was personal, it was psychological. It's like an explanation of, this is how this fury in my mother's generation came about, where you have no proper home on your island, and then you come to England and find yourself once again adrift in a new form. So it was a kind of psychological insight. But reading your book, I was so gladdened to see this vision of a radical humanism, which I feel like it, as Fanon was popping up in the discourse in the past 10 years, and I was thinking, oh, my old friend Fanon, I was meeting someone I didn't recognize, or I was meeting him in snippets, pieces, and as a racial essentialist, which I never read him to be, and never understood him to be. Though, of course, there are passages, I mean, we've talked about it, in which that aspect of Fanon is prime, but that's true of Malcolm X too. No, they seem to be very similar cases.
Very much so.
The early death, the sainthood, the moving towards a kind of diasporic idea of solidarity that then even bursts the diaspora, but gets shut down at the key moment.
I agree. Yeah, and Malcolm X actually ended up going to Algeria only 2 years after Fanon's death.
So knowing what we now know about systemic racism and the scourge of colonialism, where I always think it's important to remember that the Europeans were not the only ones to construct empires. It was the normal thing to do until the late 19th century. Knowing what we know I'd love to hear what both of you think about the possibility of constructing a genuine universalism that avoids the pitfalls of earlier ones.
I don't think it's easy, and I also think Fanon's central, I mean, Adam might disagree, but to me, the central insight of Fanon is that what we called the first world when we were children is built on the third. That, to me, is the central insight of Fanon. It is the great importance of Fanon. And I don't think there's any way in which Adam's biography lessens the impact of that fact, because that is a fact.
Sure.
It's not a woke fact or an ideological fact. It's just a historical fact. But the question...
How quaint, a historical fact.
Yeah, historical fact. I think, talking to my students, one of the sentences which came up over and over, and which must have come up during your university years and mine too, is the Benjamin, every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. Mm-hmm. And I think somewhere in that sentence is the key, because that again is a fact, but the question is it a determinist fact, which is always true, essentially and everywhere? It's definitely, is it causal or is it a historical fact? So the sentence we used to think about in class is from the document Declaration of Independence. Well, we hold these truths to be inalienable, that all men are created equal.
Self-evident.
Self-evident, sorry. Misquoting your greatest document.
No, it's just the word self-evident, which always strikes me, yeah.
But that sentence, that document, is that philosophical statement is being stated at the same time that a black man is 3/5 of a white man in America, at the same time as the Dred Scott decision, which I think formalizes in law that the black man has no rights, that the white man need respect. Mm-hmm. So it is this document of civilization that is at the same time a document of barbarism. I think the question for my students was, does that make the document of civilization null and void? Is there a way to rescue the document of civilization from its barbarism? Can it be restated, including the people it previously excluded? Or is it by its history and what has passed and the fact that it was stated in a moment irremediable? That is the central question. And I don't think there is an easy answer to that.
No.
I couldn't wander into my classroom and give a confident answer to that, because I think it is profoundly complicated.
No, and actually in Fanon, you find different answers. I mean, I think that in Black Skin, White Masks, he seems to think that, yes, you can rehabilitate the French project. He also writes about how he has every bit as much of a right to, the heritage of classical literature as anyone else.
Which Baldwin says as well.
And even with less ambivalence than Baldwin, actually. But by the time he writes The Wretched of the Earth, he's saying, Europe has done its best. It has some achievements to its name, but really it's time for us to tell a new story, to begin anew and to create a new man. And at that point, he's really addressing his thoughts to insurgents, in what was then called the Third World. I mean, he's decided to move on. At the same time, so much of the thinking in that book is drawn from and inspired by Western radical thinking. So it's not as though he's totally disavowed it.
To think about it, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a novelist. But to think about it psychologically, when I think about myself straight out of the gate, my belief and argument was that post-war social compact in my country, England, could be rehabilitated with all participants available to it for the first time, as it was not in 1945. We could try again. The problem with that attempt is that I have become increasingly filled with rage if you cannot even get the participants to agree on what occurred in the past. It becomes very hard then to reenact a compact in which half the participants refuse to acknowledge what happened up to that point. And I think that's the block that really surprised me. I think when I was 24, I thought, well, this isn't such a difficult job. There has been a blindness and an absence to an entire portion of the population that can be brought into this social compact, into these Enlightenment ideas, and off we go. But I thought that was based on the basic human decency. You know this just from children having an argument, that the children have to agree on what the fight was about before the next step can be taken. And I think what shocked me is the absolute refusal to do that.
You still find that true? Because I think there have been changes in the last 5 years. I mentioned the Guardian survey of 6 years ago, where only 19% of the population felt or expressed shame about the British Empire. You don't think things have...
Shame is not... See, the question is posed in the wrong way for me, and I think for Fanon too. That implies that people's liberation is dependent on guilt or shame from the other party. I'm really not interested in the guilt of white people or the shame. That seems to me a fool's place to begin the conversation.
It means at least they acknowledge what happened.
They acknowledge it.
Now.
I feel, for my own taste and sensibility, that's something to do with the way the conversation is had, the sites where the conversation is had, which is basically has been for the past 15 years online in these digital spaces, which are algorithmic, which work in a kind of Manichaean way, because it literally is zeros and ones, it's code, that the conversation has become so antagonistic that it's very hard to get to the truth. Like the classrooms I taught in, when I want to think about England's colonial adventures and slavery itself in the British experience, I'm teaching something like Pride and Prejudice. In that case, in my classroom, to discuss where the wealth from Darcy's house comes from is not an antagonistic matter. I am not trying to alienate the white students in my class. I'm not trying to cause a row. I'm not trying to make them feel bad. That entire realm of argument has nothing to do with history. I am purely trying to describe the facts of British history. And to me, that is an ennobling thing for everybody in the classroom. So the way the argument has formed around this idea of wokeism or anti-wokeism on the left and the right, to me is antithetical with knowledge and history. And both sides seem to want to have the argument in those terms, as something that one side wins and the other side loses. That, to me, there is no white child in my class who loses from knowing the truth of the history of a country. And by the way, there is no black child who wins. It's not a football game. It's the history of humanity. So that the nature of the conversation I find slightly debilitating from the start.
Before asking something else, I'm just wondering if you concur, if you see this kind of denial of history that Zadie is talking about still. I mean, because I really think we've gone through something in the last 5 years that is...
Well, in the United States, definitely.
But also...
there's a whole program to deny and suppress history.
Of course. No, but but that is a reaction to what's happened in the past 5 years, and not just in the United States. Nobody talked about German colonialism. I mean, or tiny. It wasn't.
There are countervailing tendencies. There are insurgent trends. I mean, there's history from below. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there probably is a growing awareness among historians who mostly worked on Western history of the need to explore issues of colonialism and race and so forth. We see this in this new global history. I think that there has been some change, but clearly not enough.
Wie bitte? Also es wird Zeit geben. There will be plenty of time for discussion from the audience, but we're going to let Zadie and Adam go.
I am no fan of Robin DiAngelo.
No,
not at all. But I do think there is something to the idea of white fragility and of the discomfort among some whites about talking about these issues and this sense of being personally assaulted because attention is being brought to these questions.
It's also something in the logic of, I mean, if you take race out of the picture for a moment, if I even think about, like my husband, he's Northern Irish, he's a Protestant. He's not a Southern Irish Catholic. He's a Northern Irish Protestant. And so the state supposedly is on his side in that terrible war. But what's so interesting about the colonial attitude is even for the Protestant who then comes to England, he finds that the people he thought were concerned with his penal colony are not concerned at all. Most English people haven't the slightest idea of what was going on in England, on Ireland for the past 30 years. So the colonial recognition it's a kind of fury that the charnel house you've been in has been not only... it's like beneath contempt. It's of no interest. And I think that idea can create a new kind of solidarity amongst the colonized. Like I was so fascinated when my husband came to England that he went from this, a kind of Protestant Northern Irish mindset of being beset by the IRA or the Catholic Irish to this realization that everybody in Ireland is under a different kind of colonial influence. So that too, to me, the actual experience of the world and experience of history takes away ideology in that sense, that kind of formal ideology that kept him in his box and also keeps you without politics in some sense, right? So Margaret Thatcher meant nothing to my husband apart from she was on his side in that she might help him not get bombed. She was not a political actor. So it keeps you in that, I think Fanon says somewhere, that kind of rigid colonial place where your only politics is in response to this entity.
Yeah, he does. I mean, there it's more addressed to the experience of blackness, actually.
Right.
It's the idea of this arid zone of non-being that you can't get out of. No Hegelian dialectic is possible from there.
You're only in response. I think that is another strange thing.
Reactive,
You're purely reactive, and I think that's another strange thing about the Fanonian legacies. I mean, the strangest one is the one which connects Fanon with Afropessimism, which you talk about at the end.
I mean, I mean, actually, this to go back to this idea of reactivity. There's an Algerian psychoanalyst, Karim El-Azali, who published about five or 6 years ago a very insightful book called Colonial Trauma. And she's been trying to advance what she calls a sort of less militant reading of Fanon that actually looks at what he said about the constitution of subjectivity in a colonial situation. And one of the things that she talks about is this issue of reactivity. You're reduced to simply reacting to what the other does. And her argument is that that kind of reactivity has persisted after colonialism in the way that sort of Algerians in a post-independent society understand their condition. They don't see themselves as actually having agency, as having kind of mastery over their fate. Now, of course, one of the reasons is that they live under a military dictatorship, so I don't want to totally dismiss that. But she sees the persistence of these this sensibility formed in colonialism. And Afropessimism is a very good example. I mean, I think Afropessimism actually has a great deal in common with Zionism.
Absolutely,
I mean,
100%.
It's an ideology that substitutes ontology for history, and sees, of course, Afropessimism, at least the Afropessimism of Frank Wilderson, would have us believe that black people in countries like the United States are still slaves.
Yes,
they may,
and it's permanent.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that even when we're talking about Afropessimism, we use the word radical, as if the furthest, the strongest rhetorical position is the radical one. And I think when you make the comparison to Zionism, you see that's not actually the case. The strongest rhetorical position is not the most radical one. And I think what interested me in this book is the possibility that, particularly in this moment, that solidarity feels like the most subversive and the most radical thing, because it's the thing that nobody likes. It's the thing that outrages everybody. It feels like a shock to the system, the concept that solidarity might be possible. And I think psychologically, I mean, my mother would speak more to this, but it's so interesting that both Fanon and Frank Wilderson were, of course, married to white women. And that's this logic. I mean, Wilson is when confronted with this fact, he says, yes, but I'm her slave. So we're in a fascinating Freudian world here. That's what he has said about that. So it seems, these do not seem to me radical. Yeah, it's extraordinary. These are not radical sentiments. They're very interesting, and they probably need some time on the couch. But it's strange that a whole political movement would come behind them.
So speaking of time on the couch, Adam, your book also stresses the importance of Fanon's profession as a psychiatrist. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I was especially interested in the sense that he had rejected Lacanian analysis, and that played a role in his not valorizing madness, if I understood you. Could you talk a little bit?
True. No, he had a lot of respect for Lacan, but he also dismissed him somewhat caustically as the logician of madness. And when Fanon became a psychiatrist and started studying psychiatry in Lyon in the late 1940s, he had a very traditional education, but he was drawn to the more radical writing on psychiatry that was being published in French journals like Esprit, which was a journal of the French Catholic left. It's actually the journal where Fanon started to publish, and that also is interesting because he chose not to publish his first pieces in a journal like Présence Africaine, the Negritude journal. He published in Esprit, and he was reading work by psychiatrists who were very influenced by Marxism and Surrealism. And who grounded psychiatric disorders in society and class conflicts and so on. But some of them, under the influence of Surrealism, had developed a kind of a romantic idea about madness as a visionary alternative mode of consciousness. And we see this taken up, of course, by some influential French thinkers like Michel Foucault, who was born around the same time as Fanon, I think 2 years later. And Fanon was never persuaded by these arguments. I think, and it's just it's really a speculation on my part, that for someone who had grown up in a country that had been a sugar colony, the idea of entirely, surrendering to this, deregulation of the senses, of losing self-mastery, I don't think that would have struck him as a form of liberation.
Right.
And he described madness as a pathology of liberty, not as an experience of freedom. So I do think that his own background shaped his views on that side of French psychiatry. But at the same time, he was hugely influenced by the radical French psychiatry of the time. He became aware when he was studying medicine of a Catalan psychiatrist named François Tosquelles, who had organized the psychiatric services of the Spanish Republic, and who had been expelled by Franco in 1939. And Tosquelles had ended up in Seldom, which was a refugee camp in the southwest of France. And it was there that the director of the Saint-Alban clinic heard of this Spanish guy, the Spanish Lacanian Marxist surrealist, practicing psychiatry among refugees. And so he invited Tosquelles to join him at Saint-Alban. And during the war, Balvet, Tosquelles, and a group of other doctors, some of them were communists, some of them were Trotskyists. They would have been killing each other if they'd been in Spain, but they were working together at Saint-Alban. They started this kind of experiment in radical social therapy. One of Tosquelles' ideas, a very interesting idea, was it's called le transfert éclaté, burst transference, and it's the idea that that the transference between a patient and a doctor actually applies to every person in an asylum. So it applies to the concierge, it applies to the groundskeepers, it applies to the nurses. And everyone has to be involved in what was called a collectif soignant, a caring collective. And so during the war, about 40,000 aliénés, the mentally ill in France, perished, and it was called the extermination douce, the soft extermination But no one died of unnatural causes in Saint-Alban during that period. It was so it acquired this heroic reputation. The poet Paul Éluard, who had passed through as a resistance figure during the war in clandestinity, wrote a whole book of poems about Saint-Alban. So when Fanon heard these stories about Toscaïus, he was very attracted to Saint-Alban, and he went there to do his internship. After publishing Black Skin, White Mask. And it was really at Saint-Alban that Fanon starts to become the doctor that he was. He starts to learn these new methods. He's working very closely with Toscaïus, and of course it's in Algeria that famously he begins to apply them, but in a radically different context, which is a colonial context. And there he found that he had to advance Toscaïus's methods even further because of the factor of colonization and culture. He had to develop a more relativistic practice of psychiatry because the same methods did not work with European patients and Muslim patients.
Can we talk a little bit, going back to the question of solidarity, about the influence of existentialism on Fanon? We know that he said at one point he would pay 20,000 francs a day if he could talk to Sartre every day for 2 weeks, and he did indeed meet. You wrote a nice sentence that existentialism was the philosophical continuation of the ethics of wartime resistance. And of course, that's a description that Sartre and de Beauvoir would have loved, since they didn't do nearly as much for the resistance. I think it was Beckett who said nobody trusted Sartre enough to actually ask him to do clandestine work. But in any case, it was that spirit. Can you talk about just a little, existence preceding essence and existentialism as a humanism, how that affected Fanon?
Sure. I think that the idea that, when Fanon discovered existentialism, Sartrean existentialism, but also the work of the phenomenological thinker Merleau-Ponty, who was part of the Sartre-Beauvoir circle, and who was teaching in Lyon. And actually, Fanon went to hear Merleau-Ponty lecture. He claimed that he was too afraid, too intimidated to introduce himself, so he never actually met Merleau-Ponty. But Merleau-Ponty's ideas are fundamental to Fanon. Fanon's vocabulary in Black Skin, White Masks, but also in The Wretched of the Earth, owes a great deal to Merleau-Ponty. Some of the terms that seem very recondite are derived from phenomenology. So at the time that he starts to become interested in existentialism and phenomenology, and he's reading issues of Les Temps Modernes, he is in a sense recovering from his infatuation with the negritude of Léopold Senghor.
Right.
Who, great poet, great Senegalese poet who later becomes a statesman. The Negritude movement was founded in Paris in the 1930s by the poet Aimé Césaire, who was from Martinique, and Fanon became quite close to him after the war. Then they had a bit of maybe not a falling out, but certainly a drifting apart. Senghor and the poet Léon Gontran Damas, who was kind of the most bohemian figure of the Negritude movement. And then there were the Darlan sisters, who were organizing salons, and who I think increasingly in the literature are getting more credit because they really created an environment in which the ideas of Negritude had a social life and were debated by people. But Senghor's understanding of Negritude was somewhat mystical and essentialist. He's famous for the line that emotion is black just as reason is Hellenic. Right. And Fanon had these scalding experiences of racism in France. It's important to remember that Fanon grows up thinking that he's basically just like other French people. He thought of himself as almost white. In fact, black people were the so-called tirailleurs sénégalais, the African riflemen. He would see who wore these tarbouches, who were, were immediately recognizable on the street. And Fanon was vaguely afraid of them until his father invited a few of these African riflemen to join them for dinner. And his parents were great believers in France. They spoke a better French than the French. They voted socialist. They saw themselves as fundamentally French. And it was really only once he left Martinique, once he joined this colonial army, to fight fascism, and he saw the hierarchies in the army, and he saw that he was included with the whites. Whereas the African riflemen and the North African soldiers received very different treatment. They ate different food. They were, there was all sorts of discrimination, and he was shocked by it. And then he has this disorienting and almost paralyzing experience of being on a train. It's kind of the primal scene in Fanon's writing. It appears in Black Skin, White Mask. He's on a train and he sees this little boy with his mother, and the little boy says, "Maman, tiens, maman, un nègre, j'ai peur, I'm afraid." He sees and Fanon is suddenly aware that in this boy's eyes, not only is he black, but he is associated with things like cannibalism, danger, violence, etc. And that leads Fanon towards negritude. And he's, his take on negritude is quite interesting because he's not, he's critical of it, but he understands that it was a very important phase for him. He had to go through it. He had to, in his words, wade in the irrational to restore his sense of self. But
it's a way of de-epidermalizing whiteness.
Exactly.
But it's a transition.
It's a transition. And
I think
that's where existentialism comes in.
Yeah, because existentialism is first and foremost a resistance and a rejection of essentialism. And he's coming to the realization that race is an essentialism. So existentialism gives him that language to discuss it as... To say it is essentialism is not to say it doesn't have this devastating structural effect. And having that double consciousness, not using it in the way of Du Bois, but in the sense of knowing that something is both unreal and also destructive.
Well, in fact, I think one of the reasons why the arguments of Sartre about existence preceding essence could be so persuasive to Fanon is that Sartre, unlike other white French writers, was writing about race. He was writing about anti-Semitism. He was writing about being Arab. He was writing about Jean Genet as a
because
gay
these are the
man.
contingencies. In existentialism, you're thrown into the world, but the question is thrown into the world as what? Mm-hmm. And when you're thrown into the world as black or thrown into the world as Jewish, this is a different structural situation. And there's a fantastic quote somewhere in the book about, it's from Sartre, where he says, the Jewish child, walks through the world noticing, feeling himself to have a name, to have an identity, and then sees these other children who have none. Who are these lucky, free children with no identity?
Exactly. And
that's so fascinating. I think that's the thing I've struggled with most over the years, is the idea that it is clearly the case that to be unnamed, to have no identity, is to be free in a certain sense. And that was exactly the position of the white figure for 2,000 years till about 2012. You were non-identified. You did not exist.
Yeah.
And it is a great freedom. But I think the deeper question, and part of this hierarchical revenge, is that now you have a name. Now you're white. You didn't have a name before, and we've given you the name that was given to us. Our names were different: black, Jewish, Arab. But the question is that hierarchical revenge all that liberation is? And then there's a deeper question too, that is having no name genuine freedom, or is having no name a kind of oblivion? Because we had a name, and when you have a name, it does make you look at things differently because you have a name. So you're always thinking, oh, I have this name, so I'm black, okay. And those people in Africa are also black. What does that mean? What does the history mean? How did I get to be here? Why are they over there? It begs the question. And the same question for Jews, right? You notice, oh, well, I'm Jewish. I'm the Jewish boy in the German class. What does that mean? How did I get here? To have no name is to a certain extent not to have to think, not to have historical consciousness. And so I think it's something that
You're sounding very Baldwinian.
you
here.
long for, right? You long to not to have the name. You long to be free of the name. But I think it's quite dangerous not to have the name.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, of course, this is one reason why he has to rewrite Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty writes about, he assumes anonymity, right? And Fanon, points out that the black person cannot assume that kind of anonymity in public spaces.
And there are more extreme versions, right? That there is always assimilation possible, perhaps for the Jewish person, perhaps for the light-skinned black person. But then I always think of, I think the correct name at the moment is little people. That's the most extreme version of difference, right? Where there is no assimilation possible. You are seen everywhere you go. Your name is known everywhere you go. There is no way.
I'm all for little people.
Yeah, there's no way you can. It's so interesting, that example of extreme difference. Like, we think we know difference, but what about the difference in which you're seen at every moment? The disabled too, of course. There is absolutely no assimilation at any level, at any point, in any way. I think those people are an interesting place to start philosophically, because they're the most extreme end of this question of, here is your name. And it's permanent, it's essential to you.
So what does the discovery of existentialism, what is it about existentialism that frees him or moves him? He never got to spend, whatever it was, 2 weeks talking all day to Sartre.
But 3 days in Rome.
3 days in Rome, but what would he have wanted? What did he already get from Sartre, and what would he have wanted more of?
I think the introduction that Sartre writes, I was really shocked by it when I read it as a teenager, to be honest. He seems so... It's like a man trying to put all his faith in something that horrifies him, effectively. Like, the idea of this black liberation is to him the end of the world, end of his world. And he can't really disguise it in the writing of it. And I was a huge Sartre fan as a teenager, so when I read that introduction, I was really struck by how much fear is between the lines. He's really anxious about this thing that he's kind of giving 2 thumbs up to in a bracketed sense. But I do still think that Sartre is essential, to me anyway, and to Fanon, because it allows for a discourse that doesn't get stuck in essentialism, that is absolutely politically aware. I mean, obviously, when you look at Sartre, he made some bad moves, right? He was always flexible, always trying to think through each situation as it approached, but some of them he thought he made mistakes and has been judged very harshly by intellectuals and philosophers. But what I admire about him is that fluidity, is each time to say, here is the situation, given my thoughts, given my mind, given this moment, given history, what now? And a lot of political thinkers can't think like that. They have one line, and they have to approach every situation with their one line. Sartre is always ready to be thrown in and to react in a new way.
And I do think that Sartre, if Sartre did not exactly distinguish himself as a courageous resistance fighter during the Second World War, I do think that he redeemed himself during the Algerian War. I think he showed incredible courage and took great risks.
Yeah. I
mean, his apartment was bombed twice, I think, during the war. People were calling for his blood. So
I also think this is a novelist's interest, and it doesn't matter to activists, but there is so much in politics of sensibility. There's something very masculinist about Fanon. It's very much about his masculinity, about the fight, about the pride of being a man, about violence needing to exist in order for you to be a man. And I think there is a wide space for a socialist, feminist critique of the military aspect of Fanon.
Well, this is one reason why Bell Hooks, in an essay on Fanon that she published in, I think it was in the catalog for the ICA exhibit that Stuart Hall was involved in, The Fact of Blackness, a mistranslation, by the way, of Fanon's chapter in The Black Skin, White Masks on the lived experience of the black man that led to a lot of misunderstanding. But in any case, the Bell Hooks essay is very interesting because she talks about her ambivalence about Fanon and why she found it so difficult to read him for years, precisely because of the masculinism.
And that happens with Malcolm X too. And I think black women in those movements are always told, shush, let's unite behind these figures. But there have always been objections and protests to that aspect of liberation, which has to be masculine and macho and has to fight to prove its full humanity.
Yeah, and there's a current too of sexism in the chapter on Black Skin, White Masks on Mayat Capecia, the Martiniquan writer, who wrote about her relationships with white men, and it's quite a virulent chapter. I mean, I think that Fanon was furious because Mayat, the woman who took the name Mayat Capecia, had been involved with a leading collaborationist figure and had gone to all these, events for the Vichy government. So I think, in his view, she was sleeping with the enemy. But there's a kind of emotional, vituperative surplus to his criticisms of her that can't be ignored. I mean, I
think that's an important thing to know about political heroes, is that they have also emotional surplus
and homophobia.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
he writes about West Indian men who dress up as women and sell
and that's a deep curse in the Caribbean which continues
and sell their bodies. And he said, but as far as I know, their personal conduct is entirely normal.
Right.
And yet, later on in his life, he does one of his few genuine psychoanalytic treatments. Fanon was not a psychoanalyst, but he was very interested in psychoanalysis, and his patient in Tunis was a gay man. And according to Alice Cherki, at least, his intern in Algeria, and she worked with him in Tunis, he had begun to kind of rethink his whole position on homosexuality.
To me, that's what's beautiful about Fanon. He has these ideological commitments, and then he has his practice.
Yeah.
And the two are constantly in tension, because what you think you know is constantly being transformed by what appears in front of you. And early on, one of his biggest anxieties, which I think is still very familiar in all kinds of activist movements, is this fear that as the middle-class intellectual, you are less than the peasant warrior.
Absolutely.
And the romanticization around peasant warriors, I come from peasants, we're not all warriors, or ideologically pristine, runs all the way through the book. He's constantly...
Totally.
He wants to shake off Paris, but at the same time he's always in Paris. He wants to be fighting, but this stain of intellectualism is over him. He wants to be rid of it. He wants to be purified of it. These are, again, things for the couch, but they're very familiar, running through all kinds of activist movements. It's good to know them and to be aware of them.
Yeah, and the paradox, too, with his celebration of the peasantry, or what he called the revolutionary spontaneity of the peasantry, is that, one, it didn't actually describe the dynamics in Algeria properly. Algeria had very strong traditions of urban protest, students, trade unions. Many of the fighters in the FLN and in the ALN, the Algerian Liberation Army, had distant peasant backgrounds, but they were not coming from peasant families. And what ended up happening with this this myth of peasant spontaneity is that it ended up underwriting a whole project of social conservatism that Fanon himself rejected.
Right. I mean, part of the problem with these kind of ideologies, they refuse to recognize some of the realities on the ground, which are often religious as well. Reading this book, I had such a strong memory exactly of my mum, young radical, reading Fanon in our housing estate, and we would often have young Marxists coming at the door and IRA guys coming at the door with leaflets, and they were convinced that we were the proletariat, we were the radical proletariat, but the thing was, you've got Bengalis, Africans, Irish, all in the same building. You have a few Marxists, but you have a lot of people who just want to make rent. You have some Thatcherites. You have a lot of people. So if you want to try and build a solidarity movement, you have to go into the housing estate with at least a realistic view of the working class. You have to know who they are.
Yeah.
And they are not who you want them to be. But they can be brought to the table in many different ways, but they are not this magical proletariat.
I think
it's not true.
I think that's where Gramsci would be more useful to us than Fanon.
Right.
So I want to end on solidarity, but I want to walk us back a little bit, because Zadie, you mentioned your horror or astonishment when you read Sartre's preface as a teenager, and this has all been softball discussion up till now. Adam, what do you do with the question of violence, whether it's Sartre's or that which Sartre, reasonably enough took from Fanon? You talk about Fanon's word desintoxication. Yeah, which you say has been badly translated.
As cleansing. I mean, I don't think he describes violence as redemptive. I mean, I think that he sees violence more as a kind of shock therapy. Fanon practiced electroshock therapy, and I think that Fanon convinced himself that violence could have a similar impact on the colonized. The Sartre essays is a brilliant piece of rhetoric.
Yeah,
I think it's an incredible piece of writing, and there are phrases in it that prefigure, future currents in philosophy. I think in some ways deconstruction, Derrida's deconstruction at least begins with that essay. So I don't want to disparage the Sartre introduction, but I do think that it gives an imprecise and in some ways misleading understanding of what Fanon actually has to say in the book. He treats violence as a kind of irrational carnage, almost like a bacchanal of killing, and Fanon, who never commented actually on the preface. I mean, he invited it. He told his editor François Maspero, tell Sartre that whenever I sit at my writing desk, I'm thinking of him. And Sartre, of course, owed a tremendous amount to Fanon as well. I mean, it's not just as a publisher, but Sartre's project in Critique of Dialectical Reason is very influenced by anti-colonialism. I mean, they're both responding to each other. So, I mean, you asked earlier, like, what did Fanon get from Sartre? I think that another question: what did Sartre get from Fanon? It was actually a remarkable relationship between two thinkers. Misleading because. Fanon is, of course, a champion of armed struggle. He believes that it is both practically necessary and psychologically beneficial. In his view, through violence, the colonized overcomes feelings of paralysis, weakness, despair, et cetera, and achieves a sense of a horizon. A day beyond the tyranny of colonialism. But so I don't want to in any way depict Fanon as a pacifist. He wasn't. I mean, we also have to understand the context in which he was writing this essay. The French killed hundreds of thousands of Algerians. They set up relocation, essentially concentration camps where a third of Algeria's rural population was penned in during the war. Rape was extremely common. Thousands of people were tortured. During the Battle of Algiers alone, there were 3,000 disappearances, mostly of Muslim Algerians, but also of some European citizens. For example, Maurice Audin, a communist mathematician who was disappeared in 1957 or 58, and whose Henri Alleg was tortured. He was not disappeared. He wrote La Question. He was, but Audin was disappeared, and it was only a few years ago that Macron acknowledged that he had been disappeared. People like Ali Boumengel, an FLN lawyer, also. Suicided. So Fanon is writing against the backdrop of the most horrifying violence. In fact, he writes at one point that in a colonial war, repression can assume the air of an authentic genocide, which I think is a sentence that has a lot of resonance today when we look at what Israel has done to Gaza. So Fanon regards the violence of the colonized, as a counter-violence.
Right.
French Algeria would not have existed without decades of quote-unquote pacification in which about a third of the Algerian population was killed. So, there are caveats and nuances in Fanon's account of violence. He argues that violence has to be channeled. It has to assume political form with a strategy. It can't simply be a carnage. He writes that hatred and the legitimate desire for revenge cannot sustain a liberation war. There are chapters in his book A Dying Colonialism, Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, on the European minority and the Jewish minority, in which he writes about non-Muslim Algerians who are taking part in the Algerian struggle for independence. And he envisions a post-independence nation that will be a multi-ethnic Algeria. In a sense, I mean, Fanon's nationalism, his Algerian nationalism, was a nationalism of the will that you could join, provided you supported the liberation struggle. And then I think, the last point I think that's essential is that the last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth is colonial warfare and mental disorders, in which he anatomizes the lacerating effects of violence long after colonialism is over. And of course, he writes about, the impact of colonial savagery and violence on the colonized, but he also writes about anti-colonial violence. For example, there's a story of this African rebel fighter, it's not an Algerian, who is tormented by memories of the mission that he took part in during the Liberation War, because he now has European friends, and he worries that action, which resulted in, I think, 12 deaths, may have killed people they knew. And so the idea that violence is entirely psychologically liberating, would have been foreign to Fanon as a psychiatrist. So
he's dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that to do this book properly, you had to explore the tensions in Fanon's thinking, and I do think the idea of violence as a kind of shock therapy is his way of dealing with the evident contradiction. Like, violence is necessary in the Algerian War of Liberation, but it also creates problems that cannot be so easily resolved.
I mean, part of the problem is the question of his violence is often put as if he began the violence. He was born into violence. It was a violent system, and he's discussing the violence all around him. And I also think there is a bit of that Baldwinian sentiment of why is it when a black man picks up a gun?
Definitely.
This is the end of the world.
Definitely.
Whereas
Absolutely.
Guns in white hands in America, in particular, part of the culture. Why is this the line that cannot be crossed? There is definitely that reaction. But if you ask me my personal view, I am unashamedly a pacifist, but I'm also a student of history, and I think one of the things Fanon is discussing is the slave revolt. A colonial country is in a system of slavery and semi-slavery, and the slave revolt for me is the extreme example. Like Jamaica, my mother's island, is a place that had perhaps more slave revolts than any other island in that system. And when I think about those revolts, I mean, I just wrote a whole book about it, trying to understand their role in the end of slavery in Britain. It's very hard to make the case that they did not have a profound effect. I think they did. But what's important about that kind of, if you want to call it revolutionary violence, is that it is only part of a very, very large process. So in England and Jamaica, that process includes certainly the revolt of the slaves. It also includes a democratic process. It also, to my mind, keenly involves a mass working class movement that created an idea of solidarity between the cotton workers in Manchester, in Liverpool, in London, and the slaves themselves. So it's a part of a process. I can't think of it as, determinate and necessary, and I certainly find no celebration in it. When I think of a slave revolt, I add that to the crimes of the slave owners, that you force people into such violent acts is at your door. That is not something that I would celebrate. But I think in his thoughts, you see the part which I think gives me pause is the part in which he expresses it as a reconstitution of masculinity. I think that is a false turn. I don't think of violence that way. I think violence, when it occurs in these situations, usually affects women and children most, and that to think of it as a part of your masculinity is problematic for me.
I know, I hear you, although he and I would agree with that, but he does also write about female fighters.
Yes, he does.
In that famous chapter, Algeria Unveiled, which is, brilliant and evocative, wrong-headed in some ways, but, he imagined that by participating in the liberation struggle, women in Algeria would achieve emancipation. Right. They would achieve an emancipation that they could not achieve under the French.
I think when you're thinking about violence as emancipatory, you have to look at the entire picture. Like, I was so struck during the, Black Panther period of that movie that one of the things that was being celebrated was the idea of the Dahomey female warrior. But Dahomey female warriors were collecting slaves. Yeah. They were not liberating them. So to me, the history is important to understand. These are not just radical chic images. They are historical realities.
But I'm glad that you brought in the whole issue of slave revolts, because
the slave is not a citizen or a subject. He has no choice.
Well, Fanon is often described as this guy who left Martinique and never went home. Unlike Aimé Césaire, who writes his great poem, Notebook of Return to the Native Land, goes back, becomes a political leader, and so on. And Fanon has been taken to task, for example, by the Tunisian Jewish writer, a brilliant writer himself, Albert Memmi. In an essay published about 10 years after Fanon's death, and Memmi argued that he lived this impossible life, this tragic, impossible life, and that Fanon's real mission should have been to reconcile himself with negritude, with his blackness, and to go back to Martinique. But in my view, only a West Indian could have written The Wretched of the Earth, because his depiction of modern colonialism is shot through with images of plantation society, and with quotations from the poetry of Césaire and Jacques Roumain and others. I mean, he still is very much a West Indian thinker, even as he leaves the West Indies for Algeria.
I also think, like Malcolm X, like Baldwin, the fact of being somewhat exiled from your own community, either psychologically, personally, sexually, practically, does turn out to be useful for the purposes of thought. Yeah. And I think
it's a totally nomadic thought. It's a thought
Stuart Hall is another great example. Yeah. They tend to be exactly the people who are not contained within the group, the club, the ideological certainty. It's exactly from that place where you're able to think, you're able to critique, you're able to see the thing from a distance.
Very much
and it will also always be the thing that the group derides you for.
I wish I could produce some tension and disagree with you, but I totally agree.
Okay, we want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but I have a last question before I turn to the other people. And reading your book and rereading Fanon, I was struck by how far he is from this, we can call it racial reductionist reading, of which the clearest form is probably Frank Wilderson, Afropessimism. And my question was, given how many quotes, and you can just find any number of quotes in both books against that sort of reading, why are people going for that? And I have a thesis, which is not just people find tribalism easier, but it's if you go that way, and if you actually look at the anti-colonial movements of, the early post-war periods, you have to talk about communism. And people are so unwilling to talk about anything good about communism, given its failure, that they would rather see people, and I've seen this not just with Fanon, but with Du Bois and with Robeson, rather than talk about their internationalist tendencies, which would involve talking about their relations to Marx and or the Communist Party, they would rather see all those people as fighting for civil rights or racial justice. Do you think I'd love to hear from either of you if you think there's anything in that.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way.
I was somewhat...
you go first. I have some thoughts.
Okay.
No, go on.
It's an interesting speculation. I think that the reasons that Fanon is understood as a champion of black consciousness, as a racial essentialist, have more to do with trends that are internal to black philosophy.
Yeah.
And after all, Afropessimism is something that emerges out of philosophy. But I think it also has to do with the text itself. Fanon's a very dialectical thinker, and so if you don't follow the dialectical passage of his reasoning, you might assume that he is a believer in race, a believer in racial essentialism, a believer in the idea that there is something so exceptional about about being black in a white society that there could be no grounds for solidarity with others, because there are passages.
But there are other passages too.
There are plenty of other passages. Yeah. But I'm just saying that I think what the Afropessimists do is they produce what Althusser called a symptomatic reading. They harp on particular passages which are very vivid and powerful. I mean, Fanon had a real gift for evoking the bleakness and despair of being the victim of racism, and of being defined by the gaze of the other, and so if it's not entirely unreasonable to see him in those terms. That's not my view, because I think Fanon ends up in a different place.
Yeah, I just have a whole lot
but there are some textual grounds for it. I also think that another reason is that, and this perhaps speaks to your point about communism. People don't have much of a sense of a horizon, of something beyond. Beyond the moment, beyond neoliberalism, or at the moment, right-wing authoritarianism, and because there has been a general forgetting of a Marxist culture, and let's say of a black Marxist culture, then Fanon gets read as a racial fatalist, and that kind of fatalism can be weirdly consoling if you don't feel that you can move forward and that you can change anything.
I think there's a few things going on simultaneously. One of them is I think, philosophical. I came up in the 90s fully immersed in French post-structuralist theory, deconstruction. Even I can, and I don't have a hot temperament, but even I can remember thinking, wait a minute, so the self has been completely destructive with that, but I didn't even get to be, wait, what now? And I think there is an element of that just as we deconstructed the very idea of the human subject, and we were just going to be these kind of relational meanings, the black subject is like, what? You did 2,000 years of you being a subject, and then just as I'm about to become a subject, it's too late to be a subject?
Yeah, that was totally Bell Hooks made that
I think that was a real problem, and I think that's somewhere quite deep in the DNA of the thing. And in fact, the philosophy I loved so much has ended up being the kind of engine of Trumpism. So deconstruction has kind of been completely dismantled and used for another purpose. So it doesn't surprise me that this kind of enormous roaring return of the subject, and the subject being black, should happen. But I also do think, I know I'm always banging on about the internet, but I don't think you can understate the process of thinking through these particular algorithms, in which the upvote is always for the thought which goes as far as it can, rhetorically and simply. It's beyond tribalism. It's literally about the way the language is used. Anything that exists in a ambivalent or complex space just is not legible to that algorithm. And so people are pushed to these extremes very, very quickly. And I think they're pushed there rhetorically more than anything else. And in the case of blackness, I've seen a return of something I thought I hadn't seen from the 60s or 70s, where there are now degrees of blackness again. There's blackness as an extreme. There's black as black. I'm nowhere near as black as I should be in order to be black. Those kind of colorist hierarchies I thought I would not see again, but they have returned in the form of discourse. And it's so interesting.
Why do you think that is?
I think, I think black people amongst themselves also talk, and I say this as a positive thing, that when you are in a society that has no movement, where you cannot get an apartment, where you cannot get a job, where there's not even the sheen of meritocracy that we grew up with, the hustle is real. And race hustling is a way of moving through this machine. And I say full marks. Yes, carry on. Because how else are you going to make your way through this system? It doesn't surprise me. And so I think that is part of it. It's certainly for a white audience. And I think a lot of black people privately roll their eyes all the time. But they also think, get your money. Why not? At this point where we've tried every other route through this system and there's none other, okay, how about this one? So I don't really judge it, because I think it came out of necessity. And I think a lot of the supposed kind of, not only the antagonism in the racial discourse or the generational discourse, is structural. Like, if you are sitting on top of young people who they're working 2 jobs, they can't pay their rent, they're living back with their parents, they don't get a job for life, they're fucking angry. And this is the expression of their anger, and I think it's legitimate. It might not be, in the form that you would like to see it, and it might be vulgar and distasteful, and the rhetoric isn't correct, but the feeling is real. Yeah. There is no movement in the society, and people are doing whatever they can to work this game however they can.
I am going to open up this conversation. Ben Zachariah will be the first, but let me just tell you, we'll try to get to all of you as much as possible. Those of you who are listening on Zoom are welcome to write a question into your computer. Use the F&A or Q&A function. We'll try to get to everybody. Please wait until you have the mic. Ben.
So I'll try to be brief. My first point was, to what extent do we think that Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers visualizes some of the contradictions of Fanon's violence theories in a way that makes sense to us more than the written word? And the second is, what does a Marxist do with a national liberation movement with religious tendencies, and how does he place himself in it? Because I think that's one of the core contradictions he finds himself in. And in one reading the entire book, The Wretched of the Earth, is to try and turn a bourgeois movement into something that you can imagine as a radical liberationist movement. And of course he's imagining it.
Great question, or great comment. Look, I mean, I think that Pontecorvo's film is the greatest political film of the 20th century, at least, or certainly one of them. And Pontecorvo himself has, a left-wing background. He was a member of the Communist Party. His brother actually defected to the Soviet Union. He was a nuclear physicist, and Pontecorvo himself left the party in '56 over the Khrushchev revelations, and became, he transferred his passions to the anti-colonial struggle. And he read Fanon was very popular in Italy at the time, and some of the scenes in the Battle of Algiers are lifted directly from Fanon's writing, not just Wretched of the Earth, with the image of the colonial city that's cut in two, but also the great scene where the women are exactly. I mean, so it's a remarkable visualization of Fanon's work. I mean, the only film I think that comes close to it is Ousmane Sembene's film Black Girl, which I think is also deeply influenced by Sembene's reading of Fanon. Interesting because Sembene himself had been an organizer among the dock workers and was also a Marxist. Fanon was not a Marxist. He's Marxisant in some way. I mean, obviously he was familiar with Marxism and sympathetic to many of its aspects. But he was not really a Marxist. He was, in fact, also quite critical of the Communist Party. The French Communist Party had sort of disgraced itself on the colonial question, and this is, of course, one reason why Fanon is so critical of the work of certain theses about the working class. This is why one of the reasons I think he gravitates to the peasantry instead. Now, this question about Islam is I think really quite interesting. Jacques Berck, who was a great French Orientalist, himself with Algerian roots. I mean, he was from the settler community, but became this remarkable scholar of the Arab world, particularly of Morocco. Berck met with Fanon and was impressed by him, but also said that Fanon totally misunderstands the religious character of this revolt. I mean, Fanon got to Algeria in late 1953. He is essentially driven out in late 1956. He submits his resignation letter and immediately leaves. So Fanon, did not have a deep knowledge of Algeria. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who read Fanon base their understanding of Algeria on Fanon's own writings, which is a mistake. I mean, he had brilliant intuitions
He didn't speak a word of Arabic, as you say.
Or Amazigh. He didn't speak Berber either. The Algerian fighters he befriended were mostly Kabyle. They were mostly Kabyle Marxists who had a very French Republican idea of the kind of society that they wanted to build. So he was connected to what was essentially a minority current within the FLN that was overrepresented inside Algeria in the early days of the struggle, but which lost out to the Army of the Frontiers based in Tunis, in Tunisia and also in Morocco. So, and he was in some cases kind of mocked by some of his colleagues who thought this guy doesn't understand that this is a Muslim struggle. Fanon never really writes about the association of the Algerian ulama, who were very important. His prediction that Algerian women would shake off not only colonialism but patriarchy by becoming involved in the struggle. I mean, it's lovely to read about, but it's a complete fantasy, right? So, I mean, Memi, writes at one point that, that those who are caught in this contradiction, he writes about this in Colonizer and Colonized. The leftist in a struggle like that has to choose between evil and uneasiness.
Right.
And so Fanon chose uneasiness. I mean, Camus chooses, I'm afraid to say, Camus chose the other alternative by continuing to support the French. His mother, exactly. But Fanon chooses the uneasiness, but because he's so determined to belong, he writes it away. He pretends it doesn't exist.
That's the lesson for today. We're still doing it. Like, I don't think he's a Marxist. I think he's a socialist. But I think any serious socialist movement has to contend with religion. Like, there's a lot of discussion of, and respect for the idea of the indigenous person and their faith. But faith is something which a lot of people bring with them. Never mind that the great majority of black people in America are Christians. So if you can't contend with religion as an aspect of a human being, you can't make a political movement which includes that, or at least allows for it, I don't know how you move forward. Yeah. So to me, that's the bit of Fanon that needs expanding, because again, it's those Marxists coming to my housing state. You have to deal with the citizen in front of you.
And how would they have understood the modern civil rights movement? I mean, progressive Christianity was essential to it.
That's it. And even the great swathes of Americans who call themselves spiritual, you're still dealing with individuals for whom this aspect of their lives is significant.
Yeah, I agree.
Mario Kessler.
Thank you. And thank you very much for this excellent presentation. We are here in East Germany. I'm a former East German, and the reception of Fanon in East Germany was a bit different one. Fanon was the first non-Marxist socialist who was in East Germany, including in the East German in the East German camp. The same by the way in the Soviet Union. Robert Landa, the Soviet specialist in Algeria, also gave high credit on Fanon. In East Germany, we were full aware that he placed the peasant revolts over the working class. We were aware. You mentioned Jacques Berg, that he neglected the question of ulama. But on the other hand, there was a kind of a trick. Fanon in East Germany was described as an anti-imperialist revolutionary, and that paved the way to publish his selected works. That paved the way to write about him, and this was a trick, paved also the way to open the gates for the publication of another great West Indian revolutionary writer, C.L.R. James.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The only Trotskyist in East Germany who was ever published.
Wow,
that's funny.
Mario, the woman next to you.
Well, if that's a trick, I'm all for tricks.
Yeah. Good one.
James, my hero.
Yeah, great writer.
He wrote about Fanon, actually, C.L.R. James.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
My question is on universalism, because I'm quite sympathetic to its importance. because I think too much attention to cultural difference in postcolonial scholarship really obscured much of the universalist dimension in anti-colonial thinking. I mean, when I read many of these anti-colonial figures myself, I'm amazed to see the striking universalism in these figures, which does not mean that there was a whole-scale embrace of Enlightenment categories, but rather there were very important radical departures that were made from the Enlightenment history, and categories such as freedom, equality, justice, they were entirely recast in a new light. So Gandhi, for instance, since you mentioned humanism, he was critical of humanism because he thought it included animal life, natural life. Sure. So how to make categories that are perhaps already in the direction of being universal, how to make them more universal in a way. So I was just wondering, and this question is for all three of you, that if it is possible to imagine universalism winning it away from its Enlightenment history.
That sounds like a question for Susan.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'm going to be very brief since I'm not the main act here. I have written a book on the subject fairly recently, and last year, in the celebration of the Kant tricentenary, we had an entire festival discussing the Enlightenment, from which one really has to say a very different picture of the Enlightenment comes out if one actually reads them, which most post-colonial thinkers just don't do, okay? You really only need to read one small book. It's a novel. It's called Candide. Voltaire's Candide is the most searing indictment of European militarism, feudalism, idiotic religion, fanaticism, slavery, and colonialism. And it's all there. And it's been a bestseller since, for about 250 years. So they were sexist. The Enlightenment writers were sexist, even the ones who were very clear anti-racist and anti-colonialists, okay? And I've often wondered about why that gap was there. But the entire category of Eurocentrism was invented by the Enlightenment, who argued that Europeans need to look at non-European cultures and non-European criticisms of their own culture. So at a certain point, I want to tear my hair out when somebody suggests that the Enlightenment is Eurocentric, et cetera, because they invented that reproach. If you want some references, I'm going to stop myself right there. If you want some references, I can give you some. Okay.
But I also think, I used to say to my students, this is part of our toolbox. It is not perfect, but these are some of the tools we can use, particularly the mode of thinking. To me, that's the most valuable thing in the Enlightenment, the mode of Kant's thought. You're absolutely right. Most of my students have never read a word, and their objection...
But they're all absolutely sure that it's wrong.
Their objection was that, essentially, that Kant would not recognize a subject like me or a subject like them. Well, that's absolutely the case. I don't exist in his consciousness. But here is a toolbox that I can use. And as for universalism, I know that humanism is so dismissed at the moment and devalued as a mode of thought. But I think their existentialism can help, because the thing which unites us, as far as I'm concerned, is that we are all death-facing, every single one of us. And on that principle, an entire moral universe is built. It is the key fact. Death as the thing we are facing, the fact that death, to put it as a child would, comes 20 years early or 20 years late, is where our ethics happens. To kill a child is considered worse than to kill a 99-year-old man. We have these moral intuitions, which is part of what Kant is talking about. And that is our universalism. And I think a lot of our politics can be contained within there, but we have to first establish, and I think that's something that Afropessimism actually doesn't allow, really, that we are death-facing in the same way. All our structural situations will be different on the route. But that fact is where ethics begins. Death is there. It will happen to us. It can be resisted for a certain time. It can be improved. It can be made less brutal. That is our ethics. And to me, that's the core of humanism. And it is a radical core. But it's been hard to express recently.
I wonder if that's because for Afropessimists, black people are the living dead.
Yeah, literally, they do not exist. And I think there is, I don't want to underestimate, and it's so hard to put into the consciousness of people who are unnamed, what kind of social death does happen with a name. It is real. It happens in childhood. Your consciousness starts to split. You become aware of yourself as a thing that is seen in a certain way by another. That is all absolutely real and ongoing. But my question is, with this new essentialism, I think it recreates the trauma.
Yeah.
It does it twice.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now the youngest children I know feel that's the first thing they know now. Maybe there was a few more years before. The knowledge is complete, along with what comes with it. And whenever you speak about it, it's as if to say, I want to unhook from my blackness. No, my blackness is as much a part of me as my arm or my leg. But is it determinant in that way? And what set of things does it determine? That is the problem with Afropessimism, the narrowness of what it offers to the child. These are your conditions, and they are permanent.
And it reduces the plurality of identities which we all have to one.
Right.
I don't see any hands in the present audience. Do we have any questions from the people on Zoom? No. Anybody want to give it a chance before we break? Yeah. Daniel. Mawiki.
It's not a philosophical question, not a very clever question at all. But given it's the 100th anniversary of Fanon, is there any political project you think you would support today? Because I know it's the new man that he talks about on his last pages of The Wretch of the Earth clearly hasn't been realized. On the other hand, you have an anti-imperialist rise, if you will, in the rise of China, which itself has grown to be, imperialist, nationalist, and so on. Is there any project he would support today? That's my question, basically.
I don't think there's any
Great
doubt
question.
he would be involved in Palestinian liberation because his focus
Definitely.
is on the wretched of the earth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that condition can change. It changes all the time, but in this moment,
I agree.
that
And I think
that's
also
where he would
I think also the rights of refugees.
Yeah.
Certainly the Palestinian cause, without a doubt. The refugees. I think also he probably would have had a lot of respect for the work of radical psychiatrists who work with the vulnerable. But you raise a question that's very interesting and difficult to answer about what would Fanon's views on international politics be. For example, would Fanon have been supportive of alliances between countries in the in the global South that are governed by very authoritarian regime? I mean, China being one example. What would he have thought of China's extraordinary boom? I mean, China has brought more people out of poverty than any country, I think, in history, with a highly centralized communist party and a capitalist economy. What would he have thought of that? I mean, it's really impossible to say. I mean, he does, of course, have that addendum to the essay on violence where he writes about this energized third world diplomacy and about the new language of diplomacy that he sees in places like Cuba. I mean, it's possible that Fanon would have had some admiration for the kind of aggressive thrust of a country like China. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, even though Fanon, and this is part of the contradiction of Fanon. Fanon, I think, is very insistent not only on collective liberation but on individual liberation. It may not be maybe not in a bourgeois sense, but he's very interested in the project of what he calls disalienation. Yeah. And he wants his patients to experience some kind of freedom. So, and at the same time, he's very drawn to rather authoritarian figures like Sékou Touré. And Holden Roberto, who was a particularly odious character in Angola. I mean, he preferred Holden Roberto to the MPLA. So it's very hard to say. Yeah.
I hope he would be involved in the environmental movement, particularly in the sense of the resubjugation of Africa with all our trash, which is now in every country across the African continent. It's the first world, once again, a dumping ground for all of our stuff. But I do think that attraction to the strong man. I bumped into an old friend in the street a few days ago who'd just been in Gambia, and he kind of shyly admitted that he was making a documentary for Jama with him, a black friend. And when I said, why on earth would you make a documentary? So he said, well, he built a lot of schools. And it's a strong, and I thought it's still there, the idea of a strong leader, a great masculine leader. Yeah. And I mean, I've been in that country and seen the devastation and the fear, but that tendency towards the strong man and that sense of black pride in the strong leader is hard to get rid of.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in the case of Sékou Touré, I mean, he distinguished himself by saying no to France. And I think that, Fanon was electrified by that. I think Fanon would mostly have been, horrified and devastated by the situation in countries like Congo and the continuation of resource wars and the indifference, the widespread just indifference to black and African suffering. Right. I mean, certainly, I think he would have been involved in the Palestinian question, but I think, when I think of Fanon, I think of Congo, I think of our phones, I think of just the line in The Wretched of the Earth about first world prosperity being built on the suffering and exploitation of the third world. Yeah. And that remains the case.
I'm going to close with a suggestion of yet another parallel you mentioned a parallel between Afropessimism and Zionism, which I absolutely agree with and have written a bit about. But Zadie's talk about the Gambian pride in a strong black man after all of this oppression clearly is part of the psychopathology of what's going on in the present state of Israel.
Well, I think what Fanon allows you to do is take out the essentialist element of it. Instead of saying, I so noticed it during the 2020 with the police movements in America, that sometimes my black students could then not see Nigerian police abuse because they had this Manichaean idea. There are white police and sufferers of white police, and then suddenly faced with this new situation, you have to have a structural understanding, which is power, and power is destructive wherever it appears if it's unjust. I think a year later I could have made that argument, but in the heat of the moment, it was invisible. There was only this local, parochial American situation, and nothing else existed. I think Fanon is a kind of...
And he writes about that. He writes about the Africanization of the civil service in post-colonial societies where nothing really changes. It's the same kind of oppression.
Right.
I'm going to invite everyone to continue this conversation downstairs over a glass of wine, not before reminding you that if you're interested in many of these subjects, we have a conference coming up at the end of the week called Bandung Spirits. It's the 70th anniversary of Bandung. So please pick up brochures or programs, come back, and join me in thanking Adam Shatz and Zadie Smith.
Thank you.